Letras Libres presenta Ciberdiálogos con León Krauze.
Queridos amigos, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos una vez más a nuestros ciberdiálogos. Soy León Krauze, gracias por acompañarnos a una nueva conversación. Nuestra invitada el día de hoy es Jean Guerrero, una de las reporteras más notables de todo Estados Unidos cuando se trata de analizar no solamente la agenda migratoria, la manera como ha evolucionado el tema en Estados Unidos desde los años de Donald Trump y más allá, la vida en la frontera, qué es vivir en la frontera, qué es ser de la frontera, qué es ser hijo de la frontera. Pocas voces como la de Jean Guerrero, pero no solamente eso, Jean también se ha dedicado en los últimos años a analizar muy a fondo el equipo de nativistas que rodeó al presidente de Estados Unidos, Donald Trump, específicamente a un hombre en particular, que es pues el gran artífice de toda la agenda nativista anti-inmigrante de los últimos 4 años. Ese hombre es Stephen Miller. Jean Guerrero escribió Hate Monger, que es básicamente una biografía de Miller y un análisis de la agenda nacionalista de Miller que les recomiendo ampliamente. Nadie como Jean Guerrero para explicar no solamente lo que está pasando en la frontera entre México y Estados Unidos, la dinámica migratoria, lo que se vive en la frontera, qué se puede hacer para solucionar esta crisis que se está viviendo, sino también el origen de la misma, porque es indudable que no se puede analizar lo que ha pasado en estas semanas, que ha sido tan escandaloso por buenas y justificadas razones y malas e injustificadas razones en Estados Unidos. No se puede explicar, no se puede entender lo que está pasando sin antes entender lo que hizo, lo que intentó hacer y lo que hizo Donald Trump y Stephen Miller y el equipo de nativistas del gobierno estadounidense anterior durante 4 largos años. No se entiende lo de hoy sin lo de ayer. Y para explicarlo, insisto, nadie mejor que Jean Guerrero. Mi conversación con Jean a continuación. Jean, thank you for the opportunity. Great to talk to you, to see you. We are doing this, as always, through video and audio as well. So it's great to both hear you and see you. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? It's a pleasure to see you.
Same here. Well, let me begin with the current challenge at the border. I mean, as you know, there is much debate in the United States as to whether this should be called a crisis. Should it be called a crisis?
I mean, it depends. You know, I think the problem is that we are using that word oftentimes without context. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis that has been ongoing for decades. I mean, there's nothing really new about what's happening other than the fact that we are seeing, an influx of unaccompanied minors, mostly unaccompanied minors who have been waiting for an opportunity to seek refuge in the United States and knew that they couldn't do it under the Trump administration, but are doing it under the Biden administration because, they have the federal and international right to seek refuge when they fear persecution in their home countries. But as far as, it being construed as a national security crisis or some kind of homeland security crisis, I think that's incredibly misleading. It's very dangerous. It's going to lead to further draconian measures at the border that are going to maintain legal pathways into the United States closed, the way that the Trump administration essentially strangled legal pathways into the United States, dismantled the asylum system, dismantled the refugee admission system. Mm-hmm. And so, when we use this word crisis without context, it can really turn public opinion against, something that is legal, something that people have a right to request, and it could have severe consequences for these people's lives.
Now, let's take a step back to a time you have reported on like very few people, the Trump administration. Let's try to find out how we got to this point. For example, what role did the Remain in Mexico policy play in all this? As we know, it sent tens of thousands of people to live in squalor, to face unimaginable abuse in Mexico. I always quote and refer to the studies like, for example, Human Rights Watch, that really describe a hellish situation for thousands of people in Mexico, including children. So why don't we set the scene and take a step back? How did we get to this point?
Right. So it used to be that if you were a person who feared persecution in your home country, if you had received death threats, if someone close to you had been murdered or you were being extorted and you had evidence of this persecution, you could just come up to a port of entry, a legal port of entry at the U.S.-Mexico border, and you could say, I fear for my life. Could I petition for asylum? And then you would be taken into custody with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. You would receive an asylum interview. If you pass, if you prove to officials that you have a credible fear of persecution, then you are allowed into, you're transferred over to ICE, and then they can either keep you in detention or they release you on parole with a notice to appear in court. Often they use these GPS tracking ankle monitors to make sure that you appear at your court dates. Under the Trump administration, because of the Remain in Mexico policy, that was completely dismantled. And it was actually, it started to be dismantled prior to that Remain in Mexico policy being put into place, because they started doing this thing called metering, where you would have to wait on this list. It was a makeshift list that the asylum seekers created. And you basically, what you're told now is, no, you can't even come in here to request asylum. You have to wait often weeks, often months before you ever get a chance to speak to a U.S. officer. And then under MPP, under the Remain in Mexico program, those who are finally able to enter and to request asylum, even if they are found to have a credible fear, are sent back to wait in northern Mexico. And this has created, there was already a backlog, but this has created a massive backlog. These are people who don't have access to, the court systems in the United States. So if there's a change to their court date, they're often unaware. They'll come up to the port of entry when they think that they're supposed to come to go to their court hearing, and then they're told, actually, your court hearing was moved. They don't have money to, afford bus tickets to constantly be visiting the port of entry. They often don't have money to afford a safe place to stay or a way to feed their children. And
they have also faced in Mexico an incredibly difficult situation, because in my opinion, if the Mexican government had invested, with the help of the United States perhaps, but if it had invested in proper shelters, if it had offered these people protection, access to health services, access to education for their children, this would be a different matter. But these people have waited, quote unquote, in Mexico under terrible circumstances. And I think sometimes that people, both here in the United States and in Mexico and elsewhere, we just don't understand, or people don't understand, because we've been to the camps, you and I, and journalists who follow this beat, don't really understand what the situation has been for these people. Could we describe it a little bit?
Yeah, so there really isn't any adequate infrastructure for these people to wait at the border. So there are some, migrant shelters along the border run by nonprofits, run by religious organizations that provide beds. But, especially with the pandemic and the need to maintain a safe distance, there just isn't enough space for everybody. So thousands of these asylum seekers, mostly families with children, have ended up waiting in these squalid, tense cities where they have to live in these migrant camps. Inside of tents, but also they have to contend with the threat of the cartels in Mexico, who Central Americans are one of the most vulnerable populations in Mexico when it comes to the cartels. They're afraid to report crimes to the police, so they're often preyed on by criminal gangs in Mexico. And so many of these people have been kidnapped. Many of them have been raped, beaten, killed. There's mass graves that have been found with Central American migrant bodies who have just been mass murdered. And so in addition to the fear that these families are living with because of the traumas that they experienced in Central America and other parts, there's many people who are coming from Haiti and various parts of Africa. They're also dealing with the fears of what is going on in northern Mexico, where the cartels have really come to power ever since the militarization of the border. Forced them or allowed them to take control of these routes.
The architect behind this policy, and again, we're talking about the last 4 years, without which you cannot explain what's been going on in these last few months, the beginning of the Biden administration. The architect of this policy meant to, and I'm going to put it very mildly, discourage immigration, both undocumented and fully documented, legal, into the United States, was a man by the name of Stephen Miller, Trump's main nativist advisor, and by the way, his main speechwriter, something that many people might not know. You wrote this terrifying and terrific book on Miller, really fantastic book that it was painful to read, but also very enlightening. So what was he trying to do? What was Miller trying to do with not only the Remain in Mexico policy, but that set of policies and changes, some of them very small changes, almost untraceable changes to immigration policy and law in the United States? What was Miller's, but when I say Miller, Trump's main goal when it comes to immigration?
Well, Stephen Miller's main goal was to reduce overall immigration flows into the United States from non-white countries. He would deny that he is motivated in any way by race. But when you look at his policies and his ideology and his mentorship, which I expose in the book, it's very much about maintaining a white majority in the United States and fears that are rooted in demographic shift. So it's not about keeping out cartels and criminals. It's not about national security. It's about demographics and it's about culture. Stephen Miller believes that the reason that we have, the United States that we have today is because of white men. He thinks that everything that we value in America, such as freedom and equality and justice, that these are all attributable to white men. Something which is obviously ahistorical and completely ignores the role of brown and black people in the history of this country. But he was radicalized in this belief at a very young age. And so when he joined the Trump campaign, Trump was about, he was about the border wall. He liked this symbol, this wall that he knew could rally people around the theme of immigration. But he didn't really have any ideology around immigration aside from, I want to appear tough.
It was just a useful slogan for Trump, right? I mean, it stuck. It was, build a wall, and this master marketer, which he certainly is, he said, hey, they like that, let's run with that.
Exactly. And it wasn't until Stephen Miller joined and began to pull policy proposals directly from think tanks that were funded by a eugenicist and white supremacist named John Tanton that people really began to, very anti-immigrant extremists began to rally around Trump because they began to realize that his agenda was not just about, increasing border security. It was about maintaining a white majority in the United States. And in my book, I delve into the research that Stephen Miller cited where the campaign was really about targeting the white working class, specifically white people. And so in the White House, when you look at the immigration policies that Trump put into place, a vast majority of them impact families. So not, individual men, not terrorists, not cartels, not the ports of entry where a vast majority of our illegal contraband comes through, families. And this is because of Stephen Miller's, immense fear that when people from Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East come here and reproduce, that they will somehow displace the white majority. And this is a very dangerous belief that Stephen Miller constantly inserted through dog whistles into Donald Trump's speeches, this idea that the United States was going to be destroyed, that our heritage was in danger. And they're dog whistles to white nationalists who believe in the Great Replacement theory, which has motivated a number of white terrorist attacks.
Of course.
But this is why you saw such a disproportionate impact on children and their parents.
I'm going to come back to Miller in a few minutes. But first, I want to ask you this. So we have now set the scene, right, with the man who built these policies, the man who agreed to these policies for political, whatever reasons, Donald Trump, and the effect those policies had on migration from Central America, and less so from Mexico. Now we're seeing an increase in the numbers from Mexico, but less so from Mexico, but still. So what changed with the Biden administration? We know, and we should mention this is not a historic surge. We are not seeing a tsunami. These numbers are not incomparable to decades worth of numbers. That's just not true. But we are seeing this increase in the number of kids and minors, and we are seeing this. So why? What changed with the arrival of Joe Biden?
Well, the truth is that not a lot did change. He made a lot of promises that he was going to be scaling back most of Trump's cruel immigration policies. But so far, the only thing that the main thing that he's walked back is the Remain in Mexico program, where he's allowing families who had already registered under that program to slowly, very slowly trickle in. Rather than wait for the months or years that they were expected to wait. And he has removed, there was a Center for Disease Control and Prevention rule that Trump implemented when the pandemic hit, basically saying that they were going to turn away absolutely everyone who presented at the U.S.-Mexico border because of the pandemic. And Joe Biden decided that he's actually going to keep that in place for most people, but he thought that it was utterly inhumane and dangerous to turn away unaccompanied minors. And so he has decided that, if a child alone presents himself at the U.S.-Mexico border and requests asylum, he will not be turned back into danger simply because of the pandemic. And so this is why we are seeing an uptick in children arriving in Border Patrol custody, and they're experiencing some capacity issues, which they are dealing with rapidly. The San Diego Convention Center is now going to be opened up to shelter these children, which is a massive space. But those are really the main changes.
We're going to talk about possible solutions as well. But let me ask you about the role of the media, because for a long time in the United States, everything has been political. And this didn't begin with Trump, but it certainly got worse with Trump. Suddenly, our colleagues in the mainstream media in English are fixated with the border and framing this as a crisis. It was very surprising to me that ABC, for example, took its weekend show to the border itself and built a set right there. It was pretty dramatic, right? I don't remember seeing that from them during the Trump years when all this happened, what you just described. Is this playing into xenophobic rhetoric on the border? Is this playing into the hands of that nativist rhetoric, into the polarization that Stephen Miller injected into the bloodstream of civil discourse in America? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now the way that the term crisis at the border is being used by media organizations, both on the left and the right, is extremely irresponsible. It is creating hysteria, the kind of hysteria that the Stephen Millers of the world want Americans to feel, hysteria that there's some kind of invasion, that we're being overtaken by Mexico, by Latin America, these really dangerous beliefs that are rooted in white supremacist conspiracy theories. I think that the way that the crisis, the way the word crisis is being used is incredibly irresponsible. It creates this, it associates immigration, which is a fundamental human right, and the right to seek asylum, with criminality, with negativity, with, this is a crisis. Like, how is Biden going to deal?
It's an invasion.
Exactly, an invasion. Like, that is what the word crisis is starting to be associated with in people's minds, and it's because of the irresponsible use of it.
Now, I also see a reluctance. This is the other side of the media discussion coin. I also see a reluctance to tell the stories of these immigrants. Public opinion. This is, I think, an interesting example. Public opinion on the Muslim countries' travel ban, this crazy policy that Trump put in place, that it's obviously no longer in place. It changed. Public opinion changed when people began to understand what the policy was doing to concrete people, right? When the media started covering the story of the grandmother who couldn't come to the wedding, the PhD student who got his career cut off over this arbitrary decision, has the media failed to tell the immigrant story? With a few exceptions. I mean, certainly there are some exceptions and remarkable exceptions that we could think of. But has the media, and when I think of the media, I think of like the big mainstream media, no, the evening news. Have they failed?
Yeah, I think they played a huge role in the rise of xenophobia and white supremacy that we've seen over the past few years, because of the fact that, our major mainstream media organizations have a very large problem of a lack of diversity. So they're very majority white, very majority male, and they're people who are based largely on the East Coast, headquartered in DC, headquartered in New York. And when they come to the border, they do brief visits to the border. They'll go, for a day or two to Tijuana or to Ciudad Juarez. And they don't really, spend a lot of time with these communities. And so it's much easier for these correspondents who are broadcasting to national audiences to fall into these, stereotypical presentations of the immigrant experience. And I think that is a huge failure. That, means, in my opinion, that the media, is very much responsible in a large way for the rise of xenophobia and nativism that we are seeing in the United States today.
And then people rarely understand. You were on Twitter a few weeks ago. You shared a tweet by Maria Hinojosa, and I wrote something similar for the Washington Post. That people rarely understand that the alternative for these children, for these teenagers, for the parents who sometimes or many times send their children into this journey, the alternative is much worse. I mean, certainly these conditions are not ideal, far from ideal, but the alternative, northern Mexico or Honduras or El Salvador, it has been very clearly documented, would be much worse. And people in America just don't understand where these migrants are coming from, what the situation is like, right?
That's a really good point, León. Like, a lot of the comments that I see on, these right-wing media networks where you have stories that paint immigrants in a really negative light, people will say, like, well, why are these parents being so irresponsible and sending their children on this dangerous route? They should never do that. Why are we encouraging people to go on this dangerous journey? And what that reveals is a complete lack of understanding of the conditions in Central America, and a complete, ignorance and the fact that so many of these people have never had to deal with, every single day waking up, not knowing if you're going to survive, not knowing if your husband is going to return home that evening from work, not knowing if your children can safely play in the street. These are conditions that create severe trauma in these individuals. And, a lot of Americans have never had to deal with that. And so they don't understand the conditions that are sending these people north.
I think that the majority of Americans have not. Now, let's get to the solutions to the problem. Through this, there are now more than 11,000 children under custody of health and human services. The infrastructure, as you have described, is currently at the brink. Is there a way out? I think there certainly is a way out. So I should probably ask you, what is the way out? What are the possible solutions that the Biden administration could put in place?
So I wish I had an easy answer, but I do have some ideas based on my reporting at the border that I rarely see discussed in Washington. A lot of the violence that is sending people north is, especially in Latin America, is, tied to, well, first of all, the massive drug abuse that we have in the United States. I believe that if we, decriminalized and regulated a lot of these substances, that it would dry up the source of profit for a lot of the cartels that commit violence and terrorize communities across Latin America, and would ultimately result in less immigration. So, I believe that if the Republican Party really is so terrified of demographic shift or of people coming here from Latin America, that they should get behind some kind of sensible drug, reform in the United States. And then secondly, there is a massive problem of the smuggling of U.S. guns and weapons into Mexico and Central America. When you look at the crime scenes in Mexico, the weapons that are seized in about 70% of these crime scenes are traceable to the United States. So whenever we talk about border security in the United States, we're always talking about things that are coming north. We need to start talking about things that are going south, and how we can work with Mexico to regulate that flow. Because a lot of, these cartels are being supplied. They're being supplied by corrupt actors in the United States, and there needs to be more collaboration and attention paid to those issues.
I could not agree more. We had a great conversation on this podcast with Jean Guerrero about this, and in the last few weeks we've had mass shootings in America with assault weapons, and I will never understand why this is controversial. When I say this, I mean the assault weapons ban. I mean, when you see the damage these weapons have done in the United States and in Mexico, I just don't understand why this is controversial. I think it's a toxic side of American society and culture. Now, one of the challenges, because I think that it would be interesting to explain that the way this process would work with these kids is the government wants to hand them over to possible relatives, tutors, people who could take charge of these kids while the process plays itself out. And one of the challenges is to get the parents or relatives of these minors who are already in the United States, these adults, responsible adults, to come forward and claim them. Years of persecution have taken their toll, because for years the parents, the grandparents, the responsible adults, the possible people who could take charge of these kids, have feared they would be deported themselves under the Trump administration. So they simply didn't come forward in many cases. Is this changing? How can the Biden administration change that mentality and encourage people to come forward and claim the kids?
Well, so that is one very important change that the Biden administration is making, where Stephen Miller, decided to use this process where sponsors, because a majority of these children who come to the border, they have sponsors. They have somebody in the United States, as you were saying, who can receive them, who can house them, who can take care of them, whether it's an aunt, whether it's a grandmother, whether it's a mom. But Stephen Miller implemented this program where they collaborated. So where the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is in charge of contacting these sponsors, was now, sharing this information with ICE, with the agency in charge of deporting families. So that it created a paralysis of sponsorship where, as you were saying, people no longer wanted to come forward. The Biden administration is scaling that back. They're walking back that Stephen Miller policy with the hope that sponsors will now come forward. That's one of the reasons that we see backlogs and capacity issues in the child migrant facilities, because they're waiting and waiting and waiting for a sponsor to come forward to be able to contact that sponsor. And the faster they're able to do it without these sponsors fearing that they're going to be deported, the better for everybody, for the better for the kids, the better for the families, the better for our own, officials who are dealing with these children. But right now, as you mentioned, the problem remains that there's still this lingering fear, this uncertainty, well, how do I know that they're not going to deport me? And so there continues to be a slower processing taking place than before. So I think what the Biden administration needs to do to deal with that is just better messaging, but he's kind of been backed into a corner, because the more that he messages in a humane way about immigration, the more the Republican Party is going to attack him as a quote unquote open borders candidate and again, create hysteria around what is happening at the border. I think Biden needs to be brave and, just ignore that criticism and just be very clear about the fact that sponsors should come forward for these children, but also be clear about what his plans are at the border, because there does remain a lot of confusion as far as how many of Trump's policies he's going to scale back and exactly when he's going to do it and who's going to benefit. And this is why you see so many migrant camps at the border, just of people just waiting and waiting to find out if Biden is going to let them in. So there needs to be a lot more clarity.
Last question on this, and then I want to ask you about pro-Trump actors in social media in Spanish, which is something that you recently wrote about that I found fascinating. But briefly, last question on this. Contrary to what Trump did, to what the Trump administration did, Trump simply cut off all aid to the Northern Triangle to punish these countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because they didn't cooperate in curbing immigration. The Biden administration has pledged $4 billion over 4 years to the Northern Triangle countries. He has always identified Central America as a potential hub for change. Is this important for this debate? Addressing those root causes of immigration, how crucial is that?
It's incredibly crucial. I mean, if we do not address the root problems of, insecurity in these countries, then people are going to continue to come. I mean, it does not matter how militarized the U.S.-Mexico border becomes. If we don't address the root factors, the problem is going to continue. So I think it's very important. But at the same time, I've spoken to a number of asylum seekers who currently are in Central America and are thinking about coming to the United States, and who've criticized the U.S. policy of giving money to these governments without accountability or following up to see exactly how that money is spent. They tell me that the actual low income families, the starving families in Central America are not actually seeing any benefits from this money. I don't think that's true across the board, but I definitely think that there is currently, the problem of having to make sure the Biden administration needs to do a better job than previous administrations of ensuring that the money that is provided to these governments is spent in an ethical and helpful way for these families.
It's going to be an interesting challenge. Now let me ask you about something else. Over the last couple of years, something interesting has happened, on social media in Spanish. We have seen the emergence of pretty virulent pro-Trump, pro-nativist accounts. You recently wrote about a couple of these people. What did you learn?
Well, so these were people who had gained a large following under the Trump administration. And, they are regularly live streaming out of the migrant camps along the border and whipping up hysteria in the United States about the humanitarian problem that we see along the border by spreading false conspiracy theories that are very popular among white supremacists, such as the idea that the Jewish philanthropist George Soros is paying for these people to come here, that there's some kind of orchestrated invasion or takeover funded by the Democratic Party, that there's child trafficking funded by the Democratic Party, constantly conflating asylum seekers and their advocates with traffickers. And what I found really fascinating was I was investigating one of these individuals who has partnered up with a U.S. right-wing media network called Real America's Voice, and is regularly featured on Steve Bannon's new show called The War Room. He is a deported person who was convicted of a federal drug trafficking charge, which would actually make him inadmissible to the United States without a very hard to get visa waiver, either from the Attorney General himself or someone high up in the Department of Homeland Security. And to do that, obviously, he would need very strong political connections, or he would need to work as an informant. And this is an individual who is currently working very closely with allies and longtime friends of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's the congresswoman known for promoting the QAnon conspiracy theory that Democrats are pedophiles, that they drink babies' bloods, things like that.
The California fires were caused by a laser beam from space built by the Jews. Yeah, that's sort of sophisticated intellectual thinking.
Yeah, so this congresswoman has two U.S.-based friends at the border who have joined up with this man, Oscar Ramirez, to spread lies about the asylum seekers. He has called asylum seekers lazy people who are looking for easy money, easy welfare. He says that Black Lives Matter are idiotic idiots. He ridicules the idea of wearing a mask for COVID. He will regularly dress up in a full body suit and laugh at people who are worried about COVID. So just absolutely crazy stuff. And now, he's becoming incredibly. He's gaining a very large following by spreading conspiracy theories about the migrants.
We saw this also in Florida during the election. I think that might have been a different phenomenon, although the effect of misinformation and conspiracy theories is similar. Do you think what you're describing, which is a pretty dramatic example, but also this network that we see on Facebook and Twitter that disseminate this sort of misinformation and this sort of pro-Trumpian nativist rhetoric. Do you see this as organic, or do you think it's somehow fabricated? I mean, there was this recent massive intelligence report that suggested that Russia used accounts in Mexico for influencing public opinion and voting during the election. When you see something like what you're describing, is it organic, or is there something artificial, planned behind it?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think that an individual like Oscar Ramirez, or an individual like the other woman who I cover, Paloma for Trump, who was caught on camera physically shoving a migrant child and chasing him, telling him that he's not welcome in the United States. people like these individuals, it would be very hard for them to gain a large following without some help. I mean, there's organic elements to it. I mean, there's the simple fact that social media rewards the incendiary. The more crazy things that you post, the more likely they are to go viral. Unfortunately, that's just a reality of our digital era. Yeah. So there's some organic elements to it. I mean, they're going around and just saying the most hysterical things that they can say about these vulnerable people. And so that on its own just gets a lot of attention. But at the same time, someone like Oscar Ramirez, he could not have come back into the United States under the Trump administration to repeatedly broadcast with these allies of Marjorie Taylor Greene without help. I mean, he needed help. So I have not been able to confirm how he was able to get his visa. I have reached out to the Department of Homeland Security. I've reached out to the Attorney General's office. I've reached out to the State Department. And because of privacy laws, they can't release data on his particular case. But it's very clear with the immigration attorneys who I've spoken with that unless he had help from deep inside the Trump administration, he would not have been able to re-enter the United States. And this under an administration that was instructing its border officials and immigration officials to never exercise discretion, even for cases of families who had zero criminal record. Like you just had to, there was this very intense crackdown regardless. But somehow this man was able to get a visa to re-enter the United States in spite of his aggravated felony. So I think that there are large networks of people in the United States who understand that xenophobia and racism sell, that they are profitable, that they can get very, that they can have very happy, productive, not productive, but
productive, financially productive for sure, and politically productive as well. I mean, if your aim in politics is to model public discourse and just erase the very concept of objective truth, then of course productive.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, when Oscar Ramirez drove up to the port of entry for the first time since his deportation in early 2020, weeks after the Trump administration had closed the border because of the pandemic to everyone except for essential traffic, he drove up with Anthony Aguero, who is the friend of Marjorie Taylor Greene's, and thanked him for his help. And Anthony Aguero was also involved in the insurrection. He participated and bragged about.
At the Capitol, yeah.
Yeah. So these are, people with very strong political connections who are able to accomplish a lot.
Given that fact, let me ask you my final question. You set it up beautifully. Thank you for doing that. What do you think the future of nativism as a political force, as a political narrative, is in the United States in the coming, let's say, decade? Will it endure as a political argument and electoral force? What's your guess?
I think it is. It's very hard. It depends on how optimistic I'm feeling. But honestly, based on my research about what happened in California in the 1990s, I believe that we are starting to move into a more inclusive cultural narrative where xenophobia is going to not be a thing of the past, and nativism is not going to be a thing of the past, but it will be it'll be relegated to the fringes. In California during the 1990s, there was rapid demographic shift. White people became a minority, non-Hispanic white people became a minority for the first time in California during that decade. And there was mass hysteria provoked by white supremacist groups that there was there was a quote unquote third world takeover, that civilization was going to end, that the civilization was incompatible with these brown people, just a lot of hysteria. And there was a huge anti-immigrant crackdown. You had bipartisan political measures against bilingual education, against affirmative action, against social services for immigrant families.
And then the 187, right? Pete Wilson.
Prop 187 was, one of the best examples of this hysteria, and it was later found unconstitutional. But, it was a very anti-immigrant decade. And then what happened is, Latin American families, partnering up with Black communities, realized that they had to fight for social justice, began to politically mobilize in ways that they never had before, and ultimately turned the state blue. And that happened very rapidly. And I think that the United States is currently experiencing the same growing pains that California was experiencing back then, where there's this idea that multiculturalism and diversity is going to spell the death of civilization. And obviously that is not true. It didn't happen in California. It's not going to happen in the United States. I think that slowly the American people are going to come awake to the fact that diversity is a strength and multiculturalism is good for our economy, for our national security. And we're just, the Trump era is essentially a national level example of what happened in California during the 1990s, but that we are slowly growing out of that.
I see you woke up pretty optimistic today, Jean.
Yeah.
I want to agree with you, and frankly, I tend to agree with you. And I think the California example is remarkable, and it's very illustrative of what should happen in the United States. And when you see young people and where their politics are heading and where their cultural sensibilities are heading, I think there's reasons to feel just as optimistic as you have shared with us this time around. So, Jean, thank you so very much. Always a pleasure to read your work, and now to be able to listen to you for this nice long chat on these topics that you know better than almost anybody in the United States. So, thank you so very much, Jean.
Thank you so much, León. It's my pleasure, always.